Good evening, everyone. Let me just say how delighted I am for those of you who are joining us from literally all over the country. I see North Carolina, Chicago, Washington, Seattle, Washington, uh, Raleigh, North Carolina, just all over New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Texas, Ohio, Maryland. You all are showing up big, and that's wonderful because I honestly believe that this conversation around mental health and preaching is entirely important for us to engage. We did a similar conversation like this, Woman Preach did last year, and it was so well received that as we were thinking, at the board was thinking about what they wanted to sponsor, they decided they wanted to sponsor this conversation again and to cover even more. And so I'm excited that Woman Preach, which is now in I think our 14th year. Oh my God, the 13th year. The time is passing fast. Has the kind of board that is active and wants to engage our public as much as those of us who are on staff do. So I just want to honor them. And one of our board members, Reverend Dr. Cedric Von Jackson, is actually going to be leading the conversation tonight. I want to, as the CEO of Woman Preach and its founding president, just thank you so much for coming to be with us. You'll have a chance to ask questions in the chat. And if you're watching on one of the other media, we're trying to watch those sites as well. So if questions come up, we can gather them in and get those done as well. So, Reverend Dr. Cedric Von Jackson, we're ready to get going. Let's go. I don't know if Dr. Walker is with us yet, but I know that Dr. Cedric is going to introduce our guests. And this is the last time that you all will see me on camera, but know that I'm here with you. I'll be chatting right along with you in the comments and paying attention to this very important conversation. Take it away, Dr. Cedric.
Thank you, Dr. Bridgman. And again, thank you all out there in Woman Preach Nation for joining us for this very important topic tonight. This cross I bear, thinking about preaching and mental health, preaching trauma and mental health. Before we bring on our special guest for tonight, Dr. Rita Walker, PhD, I'd like to share with you a few statistics and important facts about mental health, and especially mental health in the Black, Indigenous people of color community. Black and Latinx children were about 14% less likely than white youth to receive treatment for their depression. Nationwide, each year, there are between 20 and 25% of our population that lives with some kind of mental health concern. Approximately 50 to 75% of youth in juvenile justice systems meet the criteria for a mental health disorder. Over 25% of Black youth exposed to violence have proven to be at high risk for post-traumatic stress disorder. In 2019, suicide was the second leading cause of death for Black or African Americans between the ages of 15 and 24. Black American adults are 20% more likely to experience serious mental health problems such as major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder. And although the rates of depression are lower in Blacks and Hispanics, with 24% and 19% respectively, than in whites, 34%, depression in Blacks and Hispanics is likely to be more disabling and persistent. In the BIPOC community, childhood depression has been associated with increased welfare dependence and unemployment. Psychiatric and behavioral problems among BIPOC children often result in school punishment or incarceration, but rarely mental health care. Students of color, students with disabilities, and students that are impacted by trauma are disproportionately disciplined and arrested rather than receiving the support and services that allow them to remain in the classroom and continue to make educational progress. 1 in 10 US Black men are put in solitary confinement before the age of 32. And according to the United Nations, solitary confinement is defined as torture, as it can lead to PTSD and suicide. Black men in the US are sent to solitary confinement for a longer period of time compared to their counterparts. These facts and figures are just a few reasons that this conversation tonight is so important, and it has become a major part of the work of Woman Preach as we work to bring into full prophetic voice preachers, not only women, but brothers as well, who are able to rightly divide the word of truth and to bring hope and healing to our communities. As I said before, we do have a special guest tonight, and I'd like to introduce her as we bring her on camera. Tonight we have with us Dr. Rita Walker, PhD. She's a licensed clinical psychologist whose program of research emphasizes two understudied areas: suicide science and African American adult mental health. Communities throughout the United States are chronically underserved, in part due to social and cultural barriers. This is perhaps especially true of mental health initiatives. All of Walker's scholarly work has focused on suicide, and it correlates toward the primary goal of developing culturally relevant models of mental health and well-being. Additionally, Dr. Walker's research interests are Black and African American mental health, psychological correlates of suicide, race-related stress and discrimination, religiosity, spirituality, and culturally informed coping. Her teaching interests include diversity in clinical psychology, seminar in Black psychology, theories in personality, and clinical practicum. She is the author of The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health and several other publications. It gives us great honor and privilege to bring to this conversation tonight Dr. Rita Walker. Can we bring Dr. Walker on? Tyranny, can you bring Dr. Walker on? Or does she need to bring herself on? I'm not sure. Y'all, please excuse these technical difficulties. So as we're waiting to bring Dr. Walker onto our program, I do want to let you know of some of the format that we'll be following as we continue this conversation tonight. After we read Dr. Walker's book, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health, we did submit some questions to her surrounding her book. And as we bring her on, we're going to bring her on to discuss some of those points and questions, but we're also going to marry this conversation with the subject of preaching. One of the reasons we're marrying this idea of mental health, trauma, preaching, in particular in the Black church, is because a vast majority or several of our viewers tonight are preachers, practitioners in the church and congregation. As we are thinking about our churches, I think about my own church. I am pastor at West Hunter Street Baptist Church here in Atlanta, Georgia. And as we are thinking about our congregation, we have about 130 members. And on average, if the statistics are right, between 20 and 25% of individuals will experience some sort of mental health concern. I'm preaching to anywhere between 25 to 33 individuals who will face some sort of mental health challenge this year. And so, as we are thinking about preaching, trauma, carrying our crosses, mental health, and all of the things, it is vitally important that we address these needs, because there are actually more people in the United States that are diagnosed with some sort of mental health concern than there are new cancer patients every year. And so, again, this topic is so very important, and we are so excited to have with us tonight Dr. Rita Walker. Welcome, Dr. Walker.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation, for working through the challenges and giving us a nice lead up into this important conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you have written the book, The Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. So my first question, and like I said to the audience, I have submitted Dr. Walker several questions that will continue this dialogue tonight. Some parts of it will look like an interview. Other parts will look like a conversation between the two of us. But I just want to jump in and first of all say why this book, why now, and why the particular title that you have given?
That's an important question, because part of the why was in your introduction, and that is in talking about the volume and the burden of mental health, especially for our community, and in ways that we haven't talked about before, because we know mental health has to be kind of hush hush, like that's not something that we comfortably talk about. But in about 2015, 2016, what I observed was the suicide death rate increasing for Black children. And I would not have expected that. I have been studying suicide for more than 2 decades, and I just wouldn't have predicted it. So it caught me off guard. But what was even more alarming about it was that as our children's suicide death rate was going up, it was going down for white children the same age. So the 5 to 11-year-old age group, for white children, it was going down. For our children, it was going up. And my first thought was, well, I bet people don't know about this. And we need to be talking about this, especially for those of us who are the adults, who are the parents and the aunties and the teachers and deaconesses and nurses. Like, we need to have this information so that we could intercede on behalf of the young people. And so in my mind, though, recognizing that we struggle with a lot of unaddressed, unrecognized depression and anxiety, that many of us have to address what's going on for us internally as adults before we can be available to the young people. Now, honestly, there was a part of me that thought, well, maybe those data, maybe that was just an accident. There was some error, somebody messed up.
Right.
What we know is that when data replicate, which is what happened 2 years later, that there's more reliability of that data. And so by the time the book came out, I knew that there was a pattern, especially for our young people. But now, since COVID, we've seen the suicide death rates increase for Black folks at times when it was going down for our mainstream society. And incidentally, the book came out the month, 3 weeks before George Floyd was murdered. And so folks were stuck at home, as you know, but then also just reeling with the devastation of the trauma that was happening in our community. And so even though I wrote the book before the pandemic, it seemed to come out right on time. And I know we all know about divine timing.
Absolutely. Thank you. So as I said, as I sent you the questions, and so some of the questions that I bring out tonight, I'm going to speak to those and answer those from a pastoral and preacher standpoint. And so there's this saying that we attribute to theologian Karl Barth. And what Barth says is that you should take your Bible and your newspaper and read both, but interpret newspapers from your Bible. And in the preaching arena, this is where we get the notion of preaching with the newspaper in one hand and with the Bible in the other hand, right? So when it comes to talking about mental health among preachers, my suggestion for preachers is to preach with the Bible in one hand and the DSM-5 in the other hand, right? For those of you that don't know, the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5. And so I'm going to present two of the questions that I have for Dr. Walker now, but I'm going to give her some time to formulate her thoughts while I present some thoughts on the same two questions. And so the first two questions, Dr. Walker, are number one, We're talking about suicide, and a lot of your work centered around this idea and notion of suicide among our young people. So the question is, what are some factors that you feel led to the increased suicide rate among the age group of 5 to 11-year-olds, in particular in African-American students, children? And then in your book, you discuss a concept called low-key suicide, and want you to say a little bit more about low-key suicide for our people out there. But like I said, I'm going to give you some time to formulate your thoughts on that. So speaking from the standpoint of preachers and pastors, like you said, Dr. Walker, I'm sure most people did not realize the rates, the increase in the rates, especially in children 5 to 11. I mean, most people would think, why would a 5 to 11-year-old child, take their life? And like I said at the beginning, in some of the stats, suicide ranks as the leading cause of death among children in that age group. So as a preacher or as a pastor, I realize that this is something that I have to address in my congregation and through my preaching, because I'm not only concerned with, I'm not concerned just with my children of today, my 5 to 11-year-olds now, but I'm concerned about the future and the growth of my church. And so as we're understanding this dynamic, to the preachers out there, one thing I think we have to realize and throw away in our preaching and our teaching is this notion, right, that suicide is an automatic ticket to hell, right? There is no scripture that teaches that. There's no scripture that teaches that suicide is an unforgivable sin. And when we read the Bible, there are about seven individuals to name that took their life, that died by suicide. There is, in the book of Judges, there's Abimelech who had his skull crushed under a millstone that was dropped by a woman, and he was so macho, so manly that he could not bear the thought of being killed by a woman. So he had his armor bearer kill him with a sword. There's Samson, who was a judge of Israel, and Samson sacrificed his life by destroying thousands of Philistines that were in the temple. King Saul and his armor bearer, after Saul had lost his sons and armies in the battle, he had his armor bearer kill him. And then, of course, there's Judas, who hung himself after betraying Jesus. So as I'm thinking about this idea of suicide, and I know that this has increased, especially in children aged 5 to 11, I know that two of the factors that have led to increase in suicide in this age group, and particularly all age groups, are socioeconomic factors and racial cultural factors. So to the preachers, as I'm developing my hermeneutic around mental health, part of my hermeneutic has to include an understanding that a great portion of the Bible is the story of people who face socioeconomic oppression and racial cultural oppression. So I started to ask myself, where in the world can I find specific examples of socioeconomic oppressions and racial cultural oppression in the Bible? Well, that's the story of the Exodus. That's also the story of the exile in Babylon. And so to the preachers, again, when you work through the woman preach way, we learn and teach how to interrogate the text, how to ask questions of the text, questions like what could be the mental and emotional states of the people in the text. That answer may or may not be there, but you can certainly ask the question. Who does this text leave out? Who does this text cover up? And if they're left out, if they're covered up, what might be their mental and emotional states? How does this situation play out in 2023? And I told you before that you need to study with the Bible in one hand and the DSM-5 in the other, because with suicide, there's often other mental health concerns like depression. Dr. Walker lists Elijah in her book as one who presents as depressed and even suicidal. But I think about Psalm 22. And in Psalm 22, this is the text that reads, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That the psalmist describes feeling like a worm, being mocked, being ridiculed, having his bones all out of joint. And all of those are suggestions of the possibility of depressive and anxiety disorder. And we know this by understanding the markers of depression and anxiety. We know this by studying the DSM-5, having that in one hand. So then the point in preaching, though, is not just to diagnose or describe a situation of anguish, but to provide hope in the midst of anguish, right? And so the author of Psalm 22 cries out to God for help, and their ultimate affirmation of faith is in God's sovereignty and goodness despite the circumstances, and reflecting on that hope that can be found even in the midst of mental illness. So again, back to you, Dr. Walker. Some other factors that you feel may have led to the increase of suicide rates among these groups. And then the other question was saying more about low-key suicide.
One of the things I hope that folks in the audience are taking away from this is how complex suicide is. And so we have to look at a number of different factors, so much so that you may have the same factors, whether they're related to someone's economic standing or race or bullying or things of that nature. We could take those three, attributed to one person, and then that person may be considering taking their life. And you take those exact same factors and put them with another person, and that person is not considering taking their life. Like that is just how complex suicide is. And so it's our responsibility to just be aware, right, of the different kinds of factors that could increase someone's risk, but because suicide vulnerability occurs on a spectrum. So some folks are really, really, really low. Some people are really, really, really high. You may pay attention to the folks who are really high, but if you ignore the people who are really low, they could end up higher on the spectrum. And so that's why it's good for us to pay attention to kind of like this potential recipe for suicide vulnerability. One thing that may be helpful is for us to start with a definition, sort of our official definition of how we define suicide. There are two parts. One is that the person dies prematurely, and that they did something in which they intended to die. And so sometimes it's hard even for us to identify, for those of us who are suicidologists who pay attention to this work, it's hard to even identify suicide because you don't know the person's intent. So maybe someone died in a single car accident. And so that's what it's determined as an accident. But what if you knew that before that person got in the car, that they had been thinking that they didn't want to live. They didn't see any way out. They were completely overwhelmed. They didn't have any access to any scripture. They didn't know anything about Saul. And so that person got in their car with the intention of dying, but we don't know because no one knows their mindset. So I share that definition of suicide in part just to communicate how challenging it can be to know who's at risk. And it also ties to my definition of low-key suicide, but I'll come back to that. In the work that I have been doing in the last years or so is to really try and pay attention to the imbalance of the vulnerability and the protective factors, because I do think that that's what makes the difference between someone who, youth who are bullied, and we know that there is persistent and increasing bullying in our society and increasing bullying for our children. But then also those who feel like, nobody cares about me, my life doesn't matter. While that is increasing, historically, we've also in the Black community had a really very strong sense of who we are. Remember in the 70s, folks say, I'm Black and I'm proud. We have historically had a really very strong sense of spirituality and, having faith in God and knowing who our help and where our help comes from, that has been there. And it didn't just come from nowhere. Like we brought a sense of pride and spirituality with us many generations ago from mostly West Africa. Like that's who we were as African people, who had a connection to a God that we knew was in charge of everything. Now, one of the things that, the Pew Foundation and others have observed is that there's less spirituality in our society, in the world, in the US, and it's eroding also in the Black community. Now, that's not to say we're not still very deeply people of very deep faith, because one of the things, even if somebody says that, they don't go to church or they CMEs, they only go to church on Christmas and Mother's Day and Easter, they know that when there's a problem, that they pray. And so we still have much more collective faith than you see among a lot of in our mainstream society, but it's dwindling. And so I wonder if there is a connection, or not. I wonder. I have found in my work that there is a connection between that sort of eroded spirituality, that eroded positive sense of what it means to be Black, and the vulnerability, people who are more likely to say that they've thought about suicide or they feel like their life is hopeless. Because when those things get out of balance, you start to feel like, well, there's nothing else that I can do but to take things into my own hand. As Reverend Cedric was so good to go through, and I saw you all commenting, like, thank you for walking us through all these folks in the Bible, that their faith had eroded. And when you feel like there's nothing else I can do, then some individuals may feel like, well, I have to end my life because nothing really matters. And so those are the kinds of things, the two answers I would say to kind of add to this recipe for suicide vulnerability are spirituality and our identity and our pride as Black people. Incidentally, the spirituality is part of oftentimes what it means to be a Black person. I think even now, maybe only 2% of Black people in the US would identify as agnostic or atheist. I think folks know, like, you don't play with what your faith is. And so we know who we are as a people, but it is eroding. And I do wonder if for some of our young folks who I've had college students, I'll never forget a college student in particular some years ago who said to me, why are we even talking about being African? Like, why does that even matter? I don't know anything about Africa.
Right.
And it was sad for me because he didn't recognize where his historical ancestry, that was a part of who he was, even if he didn't know it.
Yeah. So thinking about the erosion of faith, right? So again, thinking about it from the standpoint of a preacher and reading the biblical text, one thing I think that we have to help our congregations understand is that these erosions of faith happen in all of our lives from time to time because life keeps on lifing, right? And so we have these erosions of faith, and from a mental health standpoint and from a preaching standpoint, a pastoral standpoint, I have to remind my congregation that it is all right for us to have these moments where it feels like our faith has eroded. That's part of what makes us human, that we for far too long have sold this, sunshine, roses, and rainbows theology, and people just feel like, well, if I'm having this erosion of faith, as you so eloquently put it, that must mean, or let me flip it, that I must be suffering from this mental health concern because I don't have faith. Or we have people around us that are telling us that we are depressed because we don't have enough faith. And if we have enough faith, then we can get ourselves out of this depression. We can get ourselves out of this bipolar state or this schizophrenic faith. We do this harm. We do this harm. And then thinking about, I saw the comment, I think it was Dr. Valerie that made the comment about people not wanting to die necessarily, but the thing with suicide is they don't necessarily want to die. They want the pain, the suffering to end. And if they could find some way to, there it is. Sometimes suicidal ideation shows up as, I just don't want to live, or I'm just tired and don't want to be here without the thought I want to die. That if there was some other way to relieve this pain, I would take it. But I've tried these other ways and I've not found the answer. So the way for me to take it is for me to take my life. And then the other point that I heard you make mention of was our ancestors. And I know that, as a Black man in America, sometimes I may carry around this weight of, how dare I complain about my circumstances and my situations when I know that my ancestors went through so much more than I go through on a daily basis. I mean, how can I complain about problems on my job when I didn't have to work the cotton fields, and I didn't have someone standing over me. And so we carry that weight around and we internalize it and hold it in for the sake of appearing strong, um, thinking that we're honoring our ancestors. Am I making sense with that?
You are. And there are some folks who would say, I mean, I remember growing up, my dad would say, if I didn't want to eat something on my plate, or their children starving, so you need to eat that food, that's on your plate. And so it's kind of like this internal message that gets kind of pushed on us, rather than recognizing, well, maybe I didn't want to eat the food because something about it really just genuinely didn't taste right. So rather than taking the time to understand what the motivators are, what the things that are driving us to do what we're doing, we say, well, we should, which I'm sure you remember me talking about should in the book. We should do this and we should do that and we should on ourselves so much that it removes the opportunity for us to actually recognize what's going on and to be able to create meaningful solutions.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, as I mentioned before, one of the individuals from the biblical text that Dr. Walker lifts as an example of depression and maybe even suicidal ideation is Elijah. And so, on the subject of depression, Dr. Walker, in what are some other general ways, or what are some general ways that depression can look differently across races, right? And as you're thinking about that, I'm going to look at two parallels for a different type of mental health concern, schizophrenia. So as you're thinking about, the question again is on the subject of depression, what are some general ways that depression can look different across races? So thinking about schizophrenia, I'm going to throw it out there. One of my favorite go-tos to preach about mental health concerns is the demoniac in Mark chapter 5. And again, thinking about preaching with the Bible in one hand and the DSM-5 in the other hand, I see the demoniac, to the preachers out there and everyone, I see the demoniac as presenting as one who presents with schizophrenia. He has, according to the DSM-5, disorganized thinking or speech. The Bible says he's not in his right mind. He's crying out day and night. The DSM-5 would say that he has grossly disorganized behavior. The text says that he lives among the tombs. He wore no clothes. He was extremely violent. He was cutting himself with stones. So that's usually my go-to. But as a parallel, since Dr. Walker is going to be talking about the depression across races, right? So as a parallel, there's also King Nebuchadnezzar. And, we think about King Nebuchadnezzar as the bad guy in the Babylonian exile story. But if you read his story, in particular in Daniel chapter 4, I believe it is, he has delusions. He believes he's an animal. He's eating grass. He lives outside with animals. He's got these characteristics of disorganized thinking and speech. His sanity has been removed. He's got the mind of an animal. He gives bad counsel to his son. He gives contradictory orders. He refuses wise counsel. And so many other pieces about him just present themselves as paranoid schizophrenia. He couldn't show love to his family. He neglected them. He showed signs of depression. Now, here's one thing that I think we have to be careful of, preachers. God actually used a mental disorder to discipline Nebuchadnezzar, right? God actually used a mental disorder as discipline in Nebuchadnezzar's life. And so what we have to be careful of is we have to be careful not to tell people that the reason that they're living with this mental illness is because God is punishing them or because they've done something wrong. And preachers, let me say this, part of my hermeneutic for mental health, whenever I read of demon possession, particularly in the New Testament, I read it through the lens of demon possession is probably the best language that these people had to describe and understand what was happening in this person's life, right? So the boy who was possessed with a demon that threw him in the fire and the water and left him lying on the ground all rigid and foaming at the mouth, that young man probably was epileptic. and demon possession was probably the best language that these people had to describe and understand what was happening in his life. Now, do I believe in demon possession? Yes, I do. But I also believe that just like the people in these texts, we have to grow our language so that we can better understand and describe what's happening in our mental health. And that only happens when we start to dismiss language that stigmatizes and brings harm to those who suffer with mental illnesses. So again, I lifted two examples of schizophrenia. Dr. Walker, back to depression. What are some general ways that depression can look across races?
Well, when we talk about depression in general, I think folks know that it's associated with just like being down and a low mood. One of the things that we probably don't associate with depression, because maybe it might call us out a little bit, is memory problems, difficulties with concentration, difficulties with sleep, eating problems, and that's eating too much or eating not eating enough, thoughts of suicide, and to be sure, because I think folks have acknowledged that, we have bad days. We all have bad, difficult days, like that happens. But when it persists for a couple weeks or a few months, and for some folks, depression exists for years, that is a problem. Now, us, are less likely to say, like, I'm feeling so down that I don't want to get out of bed for weeks. It happens, but we may be less likely to say that in part because of the shoulds. Like, I should get up and cook these kids some breakfast. I should get up and take care of what my husband needs for dinner. Like all these things that we say, I don't really have time to be depressed. And so we're less likely to acknowledge the depression. And so it can kind of exist just below the radar because, we're ignoring it, but then we also do things to obscure the depression. So folks will be depressed and someone might look at them and say, like, depression, they don't seem depressed. Why? Because that person is running around taking care of everyone. And there are scholars who talk about these depression profiles where individuals, as an example, the doctor might say, have you been stressed? And the response is, well, when am I not stressed?
Right.
The doctor says, well, you need to slow down a bit. And does that person slow down? No. They keep taking on more and more and more, perhaps in part because they know that if they sit down, they won't want to get up. And so depression can be camouflaged in that way. And then also, we in the mental health discipline do talk about irritability as a symptom of depression. But we usually talk about it more for children and not so much for adults. But irritability can be a sign of depression when it's just out of proportion to the situation or circumstances. And so there are people that we all know, you'll say, like, she just always acting funny. She just always acting a certain kind of way. Why is she always mad at everybody? Well, maybe it's not just mad at everybody. Maybe it really is depression. But it has to be occurring in the context of some of those other things that I talked about, like the difficulties with sleep. And incidentally, in our community, we do have, on average, more dysregulated sleep than exists in the mainstream community.
Right.
So that we've like, oh, well, I slept 5 hours last night, and that's normal. But hint, it's not normal, but it's something that we have normalized. And so, with the difficulties with concentration and sleep and eating and all the things together and the irritability, our depression can look different in part because we're really, really good at not looking like what we've been going through.
Oh my gosh. And we even write songs about it. I don't look like what I've been through. I mean, my dad has this saying, when we're discussing things in the Bible and we're debating certain current issues, my dad will come back and say, yeah, but ain't no salvation in that. There ain't no salvation in singing, I don't look like what I've been through. There's no salvation in that. There's no redemption in that. And we use phrases like that and songs like that. And I said this earlier, that sometimes we cause harm because now the expectation is for me not to look like what I've been through. right? That's the expectation that we set for ourselves. That's the expectation that society sets for us. And you may mention, in the book that these are things that we normalize, right? And you mentioned normalizing anxiety, and I'm getting ahead of where where I want to be in the conversation. But just thinking about the ways that we buy into this capitalistic motif of our yes, the poem by Paul Lewis Dunbar, "We Wear the Mask," right, is so appropriate for this part of the conversation, that we have to look like everything's okay, all of our hair, if we still have it, is in place, and we do so much harm to ourselves. Can you talk more about this idea of normalizing anxiety? And then when you finish that, I'm going to talk about some ways in which anxiety show up in the biblical text.
Well, the anxiety really is about the worry. And I think we all recognize that there are times when we over worry, which is always funny to me, because it's kind of like, well, if I worry, then maybe my worrying will help me fix the thing. And it doesn't really work like that. And so, we will just kind of ruminate, and that's what is happening when you're just kind of replaying a situation over and over. You're anticipating the worst over and over. And then oftentimes when the thing actually comes to fruition, it's like, oh, that's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. But, it's kind of like we fill our mind with this, not just the worry, but it's the hypervigilance that goes with the worry. So it's kind of like we've kicked our bodies into gear in anticipation of the situation. So we're really keyed up. We may not even feel it, but some folks right now, if you pay attention, your shoulders are tight. You may have some tightness in your back. Just take a deep breath in through your nose, blow it out through your mouth, and tell yourself to release
Right.
some tension. But we walk around keyed up, waiting for things to happen. And I get it, 100%. It's hard being Black. Anything could happen at any time. And then there are the things that we see on the news, the vicarious things. And that's not just on the news. A lot of folks will say, well, that could have been me. That could have been my grandchild or my nephew. And we worry, and get ready for something. So, because how does it go? If you don't get ready, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. But trouble is not something you want to stay ready for, because of what it does, for our bodies and for our physical health.
Right, right. And as you were speaking, I thought about this trope that we use, that's so cliche. People say, if you're going to pray, don't worry, and if you pray, and if you worry, don't pray. Right? That is so not helpful. That we have these anxious, these anxiety inducing events in our lives, right? I will admit that I've been selfish, kind of in the topics that we've begun with, uh, and I'm going to explain why. Um, we've talked about depression and schizophrenia. So I have a first cousin who lives with schizophrenia, and then myself, about 9 years ago, I was diagnosed with major depressive disorder and anxiety disorder. So anytime I'm discussing mental health, I take it as an opportunity for personal healing, to talk through my stuff aloud. But as we think about anxiety, I want to look at David again. David is all over the place. He's exhibiting, depression. He's exhibiting also anxiety. In Psalm 55:4-8, David says, "My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelms me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Truly, I would flee far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find a shelter for myself from the raging tempest." And the question is, what does that sound like, right? It sounds like panic attacks. It sounds like he's having anxiety attacks. And so again, DSM-5 in one hand, Bible in the other. He's having palpitations. He's having a pounding heart. If you read the entire Psalm, he's got accelerated heart rate. That's where he says, "My heart is in anguish within me." He's shaking and trembling. He's having chest pain, discomfort, fear of dying. All of these, and Dr. Walker can affirm that all of these are indicators of anxiety disorders. Now, one thing we have to understand, and again, going back to this idea of normalizing anxiety, everyone gets nervous from time to time. So that's normal. But when we read Psalm 55, when we read through these texts that exhibit according to the DSM-5, this is not the same level of anxiety or worry that Jesus is talking about on the Sermon on the Mount, or that Peter is talking about when he says, casting all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. So to the preachers again out there, one way that we preach about anxiety is, first of all, to let people know that there's a difference between normal levels of anxiety and anxiety that constitutes as a mental illness. We also have to preach self-care, because again, as Dr. Walker has mentioned in the book, this idea of normalizing chronic anxiety, we have allowed our society to dictate to us what normal is. And so we're busy, we're too busy, we're always on the run. We are always dealing with these these schedules, right, that we have to adhere to. And so this is not normal. So Dr. Walker, would you say more about that?
I was so into the message. Which part would you want me to say?
Again, about the normalization of anxiety.
Well, one thing I will also say, I can tell from these comments that this is an advanced audience, and so maybe they haven't quite normalized. They haven't normalized the anxiety, and they have the capacity to recognize that threshold. And I think that's one thing that could be helpful. And you started to go there, which was, at what point is what I'm going through or what I'm dealing with or what I'm experiencing problematic? And I can't help but to wonder if we normalize our worry, the tightness in the chest, if we normalize it because we just push through it. Because the threshold in part for diagnosing disorder is I am impaired. I am unable to work at home. I'm unable to take care of my family, to focus and study schoolwork for those who are taking classes in the evenings. At the point when I'm compromised in being able to take care of my responsibility, then we start to wonder if there is in fact a disorder. Now, even though I use the language of disorder and you started it because you talked about the DSM, oftentimes we don't meet the criteria, like the traditional criteria, especially for depression, because you have to be able to say, I'm not able to do the things that I'm responsible for doing, taking care of my responsibilities. I've got low mood. And if we're not endorsing the right items on these diagnostic interviews, then we're not going to meet the criteria. And so interestingly, oftentimes Black folks are less likely to meet the criteria actually for major depressive disorder, but we have many more symptoms. So we have a lot more of the other kinds of things that suggest that there is a disorder without necessarily meeting the criteria, which is quite fascinating. And again, because we oftentimes just push through, there are folks who, and I talk about the anxiety in particular in the book, because I know that we are accustomed to having physical stuff, heart stuff, hypertension, like we have all kinds of chronic health issues. And so oftentimes I think the chronic health issue, the emotional health issues are ascribed to a physical health challenge, when in fact it is something that's related to, how we're thinking about the world, how we're thinking about our capacity to deal with what's happening around us, because that's when our stress gets to us, right? So we all experience a lot of stress. But at the point when we start to feel like, okay, I can't handle this, this is too much, that's one of the ways that we increase our vulnerability to symptoms of anxiety and symptoms of depression. And so we also have to be aware of the things that we tell ourselves that can escalate what our experience may or may not be. So I don't know if that got to the, trying to shed a little bit more light on depression and anxiety, but I'm happy to, Black woman syndrome. See, you all don't need me. You don't really need me here. You got this You got
No,
this.
this has been rich. This has been great. So now I'm thinking though about communal support for those that are living with mental health concerns. One of my favorite studies was done by Matthew Stafford, um, and you may have heard of his book Grace for the Afflicted, um, where he does a wonderful job of going through the Bible and talking about how different characters in the Bible present as those that have mental health concerns. But again, in the vein of communal support, the study that Stafford conducted, basically asked 4 different questions to a whole bunch of folks who were church goers, and we know the correlation of having proper health care and the support from the church. But some strange things came out that Stafford asked. One question was, has anyone ever told you that you don't have a real mental health concern, even though you've been diagnosed by a real physician? And just the number of people who responded, like up to 40%, said that yes, I have had someone tell me in my church that I didn't have a real condition. And the person that told me that was my pastor. Has anyone ever told you you've been on meds for mental health concerns? And the answer was astronomically yes. There were several people in my church who told me that, and the person who told me was my pastor. And then has anyone ever told you that you the source of your depression, anxiety, or whatever mental health concern is your sinful lifestyle? And the answer was yes. A whole lot of folks in my church told me that. And then the final one was, has anyone ever told you that your mental health concern was due to demon possession? And yes, a whole lot of folks in my church told me that. So again, communal support. And I'm thinking about going back to Mark chapter 5, the man in the graveyard. And the text is really specific in saying that part of the reason that he was there was because the community didn't know what to do with him. They had tried to chain him and put shackles on him, and he would break the shackles and the chains. And so now they send him to the cemetery to live. And toward the end of the story, when he is healed and clothed and in his right mind, then the community all of a sudden is afraid of his healing, right? And again, communal support. So when I think about Job, I see Job as a model of PTSD. In that all that he's lost, all that he has endured, and then he has these friends who don't know the things to say, and they are accusing him of all of these sinful actions. And then his wife is encouraging him to curse God and die. And again, thinking about communal support, lack of support from the friends. The wife is going through the same situation. And she sees her man going through, and her resort is, let's just curse God and die. So how important, I mean, and I know this is just like, this is probably a rhetorical question, but let's just talk about the importance of adequate communal support to those that are living with mental health concerns, having a church and a pastor who understands, and is not intimidated to the point of, I have all the answers and I'm not going to tell you to go to a counselor because I'm your pastor. And yeah, so.
Well, the community is beyond important. That's why we're here, in community, and everyone's, chatting about, experiences they've seen or observed, or how harmful, unfortunately, the community can be, including the church. And for me, I always, as I think maybe just as a researcher, I approach all of these conversations from a place of curiosity. And that's something that I encourage the community to adopt and to be, and that is curious. So it works in part because, oftentimes folks just don't know. We don't know what to say, right? Like, I got to say the right thing. And so rather than trying to say the right thing, maybe be curious, ask the individual, what's been going on for you, what's been the most difficult thing about what's been going on? Because, a lot of folks got a lot going on and they might give you a lot. And then you're like, okay, I don't know what to do with that. So then you can narrow it down and say, what's been the most difficult? Part of the challenge for individuals who are struggling is because when they reach out to the community, they get minimized or told they're crazy or say you don't have, enough faith and things of that nature. But if people in the community were more curious, then they wouldn't say things like that, so that folks are more inclined to keep things to themselves. Because the problem of keeping, and we talk about anxiety and depression, I'll mention this for the audience, those are the two most commonly diagnosed types of challenges. First and foremost, anxiety, and then secondary depression, even though historically we talk more about depression, but anxiety and depression, two most common. We are more likely to end up in emergency department getting mental health care because we wait until we're at the point of crisis. Interestingly, the people in emergency department, they're not equipped to deal with mental health challenge. And so that's why we have to pay more attention when folks are getting to the place where they're overwhelmed, where they're stressed, so that we can offer some kind of intervention before they get to the place of crisis. And so part of the, the curiosity also, in trying to keep the person from getting to a place of crisis is recognizing that we in the community will oftentimes have a different perspective. So if someone is struggling, they're struggling for a reason. Like they can't problem solve. They can't see a different perspective. They don't remember the scripture that you readily know because you just read it last night. And so they need the people in the community to be able to offer stories and to talk about, how Job did eventually persist, and how David was able to overcome. They need to be able to hear those stories, but maybe from a place of curiosity. Do you remember what happened with David? Do you remember? Would you be up for us having a conversation about it rather than launching into a conversation? Because oftentimes people don't say what's going on with them, again, because they are concerned about what the reaction is going to be, or that they're going to be judged, or that they're not going to be heard fully. And so we have to have a curious community, in the interest of kind of neutralizing what some members of the community, as have done in the past that have been harmful, and maybe even acknowledge that. I understand you may not want to talk about it right now. Maybe you tried to talk to somebody from the church before and the reaction you got just wasn't a good one. And I know that happens a lot, but I just want you to know I'm here to listen and support you however I can.
Absolutely. I see that we're getting ready to move toward the question and answer period. But before we do, I'm going to give a closing thought and then ask Dr. Walker. Well, actually, I'm going to ask Dr. Walker to give a closing thought. And then I will come back and give a closing thought as well. Then we will have one of our board members come and address the audience. And then we'll start with questions. So Dr. Walker, closing thoughts.
I'll take this opportunity to close and be a good steward of the questions that you asked that I didn't respond to. And it's important to me because of how we do have greater awareness of physical health challenges in our community. Folks will say like, someone who has type 2 diabetes, are you sure you need to be eating that? Have you checked your pressure lately? We have gotten to a place where we're doing so much better about that. And one of the things that I did do in the book was to introduce this idea of low-key suicide, because there are folks who aren't being mindful of their health. And remember the definition that I gave about dying prematurely. So I don't think that people intend to die. There isn't that intentionality, but there is some neglect that is happening around our physical health. And we may not realize that a lot of people who have, say, type 2 diabetes and a lot of these chronic health conditions, about 50% of them also have elevated depression. And so we're asking them about remembering to check their blood sugar and to eat well and exercise, and they're depressed. So it's almost too difficult to have the concentration to do all those things for one's physical health, but they may die prematurely because they're not taking care of whatever it is that the physician or primary care doctor has said that they need to do. And so this is where we as a community, come in with regard to normalizing these conversations around the connection between physical and emotional health, how even if we don't meet criteria for major depression, that just having too much depression and stress on board can compromise our capacity to take care of our physical health. We need to be normalizing these kinds of conversations because, as you all know, the mind and the body are connected. And somehow we get into these patterns of trying to put the mind, I guess, over here and the body over here and the spirit over here. It's always fascinating to me, but they're all connected. And so I appreciate, the questions that are coming, and I encourage us all to be part of a curious community, so that we can get to folks before they get to the place of crisis, and so that people really don't struggle more than they need to. Thank you, Doc.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for that. And so I'd like to add, as a closing thought, that when we think about these individuals that we have identified in the biblical text, as those who present as having mental health concerns, David, the demoniac, the boy with epilepsy, King Saul, even Nebuchadnezzar. Even though these individuals present as having these issues, for most of them, there is a moment or a period of redemption for them. And I'm lifting this idea to say that as we identify these individuals and find out how we relate to them and how they relate to us, we always end, preachers, with the story of redemption. At some point, it may not come immediately, but somehow we have to show the redemptive power of God in our lives as it relates to mental health concerns. And so the redemption for David is that even though he presented as one having depression and or anxiety, God still used David, right, for God's purpose. And I say that to say that although we may live with these conditions, although we may live with these concerns, although we have this cross that we have to bear, God still is able to use crosses for God's glory. God is able to use us for God's glory. And for this, we give God praise. Again, I want to thank Dr. Walker on behalf of our founder and CEO, Reverend Dr. Valerie Bridgman. Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you on behalf of Reverend Dion Bossier for she is our president, and our entire board. Thank you for taking the time out to be with us this evening.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Sean Whitehead is up next with our appeal to the audience.
My goodness, greetings of peace, everyone. What an important discussion, deeply needed, honest, powerful discussion from Dr. Walker and Reverend Dr. Vaughn Jackson. So very grateful to you all for that. And I can tell by all of the comments, I was trying to take notes and I just kind of gave on up on that because so much wisdom and knowledge was pouring forth in this space. Friends, I just want to talk to you tonight about, as we support Mental Health Awareness Month, we know that ministry does not go forward without a commitment to cover the topics that are critical to people. And Woman Preach, the Woman Preach Nation, we have been committed to doing things that invite people to be partners on the journey with us. So I just wanted to take this time on behalf of the board of directors to invite you into partnership with us. And that partnership can be lived out in different ways. That could be a meaningful gift today. That could be a commitment to give financially on a monthly basis. That can be an invitation to, 10 friends or 10 colleagues to give because you understand the value of the quality of the programming that Woman Preach brings on a consistent basis, like what we have just experienced here tonight. What a gift that was. So I'm just wanting to know if you would consider taking the time and the opportunity to go to our website and join us in this giving endeavor. Our website is www.womanpreach.org. And when you go to the website and click on giving, you have the opportunity to give monthly, or you can click to make a one-time gift. And so our site also requires that you put in all of your information. Again, friends, that is www.womanpreach.org. You have been with us. It's been a whole hour tonight. And so what we really want to ask is if you would be willing to take an extra 10 minutes when we are done to go to the website and give, to ensure that Woman Preach will be here for decades to come with programming and initiatives like what you have experienced tonight. If you have found our programming meaningful, friends, if you have been touched by the various initiatives that Woman Preach shares, like I have been touched, if your own ministry has been impacted by this work, could you please take just a few minutes to go to the website and enter your information, enter your gift. Let us know who your gift honors, or what your motivation for the gift is, so that we can stay in touch with you. Because here's the thing, sharing your information really does give us an opportunity to express our gratitude to you, and it increases that great cloud of witnesses that declare that this work matters. So here's the truth of the matter. Woman Preach, we are not sustainable without your gifts. A mentor that I was just speaking with was helping me to understand that our individual gifts and church ministry gifts, our community-based gifts, are essential to our financial well-being. And you can hear my dog barking in the background. As you can clearly see, I'm not here alone tonight. But really, the biggest testament to do this work and to do it well is a commitment to give and support. And so we want your best gift, and we don't identify what that is for you. You and the divine know that. Your best gift matters to us. We are clear that we benefit from, we say, time and talent and treasures, but we also say ties and testimony of our community. So even if you're not in a financial position to give today, your ties to the community can help us. Again, like I said earlier, if you let 10 people know about how this workshop impacted you, that time that you spent in conversation with us, it's meaningful, and it can be a catalyst for someone else to give. That's an incredible gift to us. So sharing your testimony, your story about why and how Woman Preach matters. Financial support, we want to be clear that you understand that financial support is not the only support that sustains us. This is a critical part of our program too. And so, here's the thing, we're only able to do this work because of the commitment investment of so many people just like you. And so, friends, here's the thing. We journey in community and in relationship. Won't you join us to ensure that, as we say, compelling preaching, that it continues to go forth in this nation and world, that we continue to encourage and equip and prepare preachers for ministry? Your gift to Woman Preach Nation matters, because Woman Preach matters. And so thank you so much. I want to say that this also is important. If you find that going to the website is something that you can't do at this time, you can write us at admin@womanpreach.org, and we will walk with you to share other ways that giving can happen in this way. God bless you, friends. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to have our question and answer period at this time. So God bless you. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
All right, welcome back. Thank you, Pastor Sean, for that very engaging request. And thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. We are going to have our admin put up the questions, but I do have a couple that I do see in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead. One question we have here, Dr. Walker, is, do we need to be a licensed clinician to use the DSM-5 correctly or responsibly?
I would probably strongly advise that the person at least consult with someone who's been licensed and spent some time with the DSM. Someone who isn't trained can get some reasonable clues for sure. But oftentimes, also, if you look at, I think of like WebMD and some of those sites where you just do a search for symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety, they also do give a more layperson's approach to being able to diagnose. So I hope that helps. One of the differences for the actual DSM, for one thing, it's a thick thing. I don't know, it's a big old encyclopedia, really. And then sometimes it'll say, if you meet these criteria, and then it has an if and a then. Whereas when you just go to a reputable health or mental health site, and I even think about SAMHSA, so SAMHSA.org. That is a really very reliable site to be able to share symptoms of not just depression, anxiety, but a lot of different other kinds of challenges. And I mention that because a lot of the SAMHSA work is supported by empirical research and theory that have been well established and well guided.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I also want I want our audience to know that I am not a licensed clinical therapist or counselor or psychologist. And so as I'm using the DSM-5, I'm using it more so to evaluate texts in the Bible and not to diagnose members of my church. I have no qualms about referring my members to the appropriate professionals so that they can get the counseling, therapy, and even medication that they need. And so I do want the audience to know that preachers have to put ourselves in the position that if we're not trained in this field, then we refer our members to people who are trained in the field. Next question. The next question I see is, what are ways to repair the breach of warped theology? Wow. So I guess this is me as preacher pastor. So what are ways to, so first of all, study to show thyself approved, right? Study to show thyself approved. I mentioned the woman preach way of approaching a text earlier. And interrogating the text is very important, and asking questions as we prepare. But also other ways to repair the breach of warped theology is to broaden our study to include work by theologians that look like us. A lot of our theology has been driven by old white men. And to breach that chasm, we need to read more theologians that look like us, that think like us, that think from a liberationist standpoint, that think from a womanist standpoint. And so as we bring those voices to the table and to the interpretation of biblical text, for tonight's conversation in the arena of mental health, I think that those are ways that we can bridge that gap or breach that chasm of warped theology. I hope that answers your question. Next question. Oh, how do you feel about mental health first aid? So I will say that I have gone through the mental health first aid training. And one of the most important things that we find out that we learn in mental health first aid is that this is not training to help us diagnose, but this is training to help us understand, right? And to put ourselves in a position where we can be empathetic and sympathetic to those that are living with mental health concerns. So if you're going through mental health first aid is an attempt to raise awareness and to increase your level of empathy, then I think it's a wonderful program. I would caution you against trying to use it to do something that is not designed to do. Dr. Walker, what would you say about
I was actually going to add that I have not been through that particular training, though I know that it's popular and a lot of people use it and find it to be really very valuable. In my mind, just based on what you were saying, that we could all use a little bit of a boost with regard to our empathy and understanding mental health from a different perspective, because there's so much messaging, as you all know, in our society that really does undermine and dismiss and crazify what it means to have some kind of mental health challenge. And any training or any perspective that allows us to be able to have a different sense of what someone might be struggling with, I think can be a good thing. QPR, question persuade QPR, question persuade refer, is a training that lay folks can participate in, that is especially helpful for people who could be in a suicide crisis. And I think that, and I tell people this all the time, and one of the reasons that I talk about suicide in my book is because it's something that folks you kind of happen upon. So they may have a close relationship with somebody or a family member or a friend who is suicidal, and then they go into panic mode because they just don't have the wherewithal to be able to have a conversation about suicide. And so I think that QPR is a good one for folks to train if they can, to read about, and to at least, folks who haven't read the Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health, I actually provide some language in there, with regard to how to talk to and think about suicide for some of our younger people, or really just anybody, to be honest. And so again, this is that stay ready so you don't have to get ready. In this perspective, it's a good thing for folks to have some of these trainings on board.
Absolutely. Next question. How would you define trauma-informed ministry? What suggestions might you suggest for faith communities as they try to build responsible, effective trauma-informed ministry?
Is that one?
I think that's to me.
Okay.
So trauma-informed ministry, and what suggestions might, thank you for making that larger. What suggestions might you suggest for faith communities as they try to build responsible, effective trauma-informed ministry? So when we think about trauma-informed ministry, again, so one of my friends, Charlie Caswell, he's in Memphis. He does a lot of work around ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so one of the things that he preaches and teaches is life is not so much what's wrong with you, but life is about what happened to you. And as we walk through life and as we process our events, the events in our lives, we should ask ourselves the question, what happened, right? And so I think from the standpoint of a trauma-informed ministry, that's a good question to start from. What happened? What were you abused? Did you grow up in a home that was where there were drugs or weapons or violence? All of those kinds of questions, all of those kinds of factors, and then asking yourself how these factors have affected your present. And so being informed, being understanding, asking the questions, like Dr. Walker said earlier, I think being curious about other people's lives. When I was in seminary, we called it exegeting your congregation, learning how to understand the struggles of your congregation, and then providing the ministry from that standpoint. Those are my first thoughts surrounding trauma-informed ministry. If you have other pieces that you might want to add, Dr. Walker.
Just as a reaction to what Sonia Horton posted, that was, what happened, with an exclamation point and a question mark, and making sure that, because sometimes how you say it is as important as what you say. And so even when we have a lovingly curious way of asking, saying, well, tell me what happened, for you. And then give people time to be able to respond, because sometimes You know, folks have had so much difficulty with the church that it can be jarring when someone reacts in a way that you don't expect. And so we have to give people also just the room and the space to be able to just tell their story, and maybe even circle back to the person and say, you know, I heard you say this, this, and this. You know, did I miss anything? Was there anything that was important that you thought about since the last time we had a chance to talk? And again, just being open for individuals who may be struggling. But thank you. I love the questions that are being posted and shared.
Absolutely. So the next question, Dr. Walker, you began speaking about language. What should we keep in mind regarding language regarding death by suicide?
Yes, well, first and foremost is resisting using the word committed with suicide, if at all possible. Historically, suicide was considered to be a crime. It was considered criminal to engage in suicidal behavior. And so that's why folks would talk about committing suicide. But as we know, it's not. Suicide is not criminal. People are oftentimes, yes, trying to get away from, avoid pain. And so what they're engaging in isn't criminal behavior. And so when we talk about somebody committing suicide or thinking about committing suicide, we're already or automatically putting them in a bucket of doing something that's criminal. And so we can say that someone is thinking about suicide, or maybe someone died by suicide. Maybe they had a non-fatal attempt. So they attempted to die, but they didn't, or their attempt was in fact fatal. So that's first and foremost. Whenever I talk to folks in the media, I try to remove that language of committed from suicide. And also, since I did introduce this idea of the word should, and I see it there in the question, one of the things that I encourage and I drive my doctoral students crazy about this, in full disclosure, is to not use the word should, and to replace in everything that we do the word should with it would be helpful. Because in my mind, when we use should and we say, well, I should do this and I should do that, kind of like I should work out, I should eat better, all those things that we tell ourselves, we oftentimes remove the opportunity to problem solve what might be happening. And so I know I'm completely deviating from the question that was asked, but just taking an opportunity here to give folks, again, just expanding our language, expanding our vocabulary. And so as an example, if someone says, you know, like, well, I should go to bed earlier because I need to get that 7 or 8 hours of sleep, but they just don't. They get the 5 hours every night. Well, it would be helpful if I went to bed earlier. But what's keeping me from going to bed earlier? What do I need to change about my routine? So it opens up the possibilities of problem solving when we can say, well, rather than I should, which kind of shuts down problem solving, well, I should do that. Well, I'm not. Oh, well, you just keep it moving. But instead saying, okay, what's keeping me from doing whatever it is that's important for my life or for my family, for my community, for my church, for whomever.
Before we move to the next question, I'd like to add a piece about language, not just regarding death by suicide, but language concerning mental illness in general. That we should it would be helpful if we work on expanding our language or limiting our language, adjusting our language so that the language that we use does not further stigmatize mental health or mental illnesses. So, you know, as a joke, we may say that a person who is diagnosed with schizophrenia, we may say that they're a schizo. Or, you know, we throw around the word crazy a lot where it relates to mental health, but using that kind of language only further stigmatizes mental illness. And so not only do we need to be mindful of our language regarding death by suicide, but about mental health in general or mental illness in general. The next question I see is, and this will be the last one, I believe. Question: therapy is important and expensive. How could should churches support congregants who are successful in identifying their new best friend but are struggling to pay them? I know that says churches, but Dr. Walker, I think you have more expertise in access and resources. So I'm going to defer to you on that question, if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, there are a number of different resources that come to mind that may not be connected to the church per se, but because of the concern about, it being expensive and inaccessible. One of the things to keep in mind that a lot of folks, I think, don't think about is for people who are employed and have full benefits, that there is the EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, that is affiliated with the job. And I know there are folks who would have concern about, my business getting out. All licensed professionals are required to have or to provide confidential services. And so what that means is that unless you are believed to be a threat to yourself, to your own life, or to someone else, or to some vulnerable person like an elderly person or a child, nothing you say goes outside of your therapy. And again, even in those other circumstances, it's really about protecting vulnerable people, the lives of vulnerable people. But if you said, I can't stand, my spouse, then your spouse isn't going to find that out. Your supervisor, your manager is not. So EAP, there are folks who would say, I don't like those EAP therapists, but then there are people who at least try. And so for someone who is thinking about care, identify 3 EAP related therapists, try them out. If they don't work, okay. But oftentimes there's someone in there who could be a good match. The single most important factor in whether or not someone can meet their therapy goals is their kind of personality match with the therapist. A lot of folks don't know that. But if you can work with that person, and I know oftentimes they don't look like us, y'all, I know. But I even have a chapter in the book on how to find a therapist who may not look like you, but who can still provide care for you. And for people of faith who oftentimes feel like a lot of these providers, like they just don't get it. You can, when you interview them, you can say, I'm going to need to be able to talk about the Bible, in my therapy. Is that something you can work with me on? And if they say no, then you go on to the next person. Most therapists, I would think, would be able to work with you, even if they are not someone who identifies as a Christian, because therapists are supposed to be able to use whatever resources you already have on board, rather than trying to create new ones, maybe help you to refine what you already have in your toolkit. For people who are in a major city, major cities usually have major research institutions, and those research institutions have clinics where there are doctoral students in training working on their graduate degrees. And so as an example, I'm in Houston at the University of Houston. I supervise our doctoral students who are working on their PhDs, and they provide care on a sliding scale. In Texas, we're actually providing care pro bono for people who are part of the food and beverage industry. So reach out to your university and find their psychology department or their counseling psychology program and ask them if they have a clinic where they're providing pro bono care. Y'all, there are major universities all over the country. And so I know that there are a lot of places who are even providing remote care. So as an example, if you're in California, you can reach out to the folks who are and you're in LA, you can reach out to the folks who are at UC San Francisco and see if they have someone who can provide care on a sliding scale. And then the final one that comes to mind is the Federally Qualified Health Centers, FQHC. They have behavioral health, so Federally Qualified Health Center, FQHC. They have a behavioral health dimension. And so the folks at the FQHC also are providing care on a sliding scale. It's based on income and things of that nature. And so there are a number of different opportunities. And then, of course, okay, I literally just lost that thought. But there are a number of different ways to be able to provide care. And I may mention some in the book, but I think those are the main ones that I like to talk about.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Walker. Thank you all so very much for attending this very, very important conversation surrounding mental health, trauma, and preaching. This cross I bear. I am so honored to have been given the opportunity to meet Dr. Walker and to work on behalf of our board at Woman Preach. We are continuing to strengthen the voices, the prophetic voices of individuals who are seeking to do God's will. One of our board members has coined the phrase that we are working on stamping out bad preaching, one preacher at a time at Woman Preach. And so again, thank you so very much on behalf of our board, on the behalf of our president, our CEO, our founder. God bless you. We pray that you continue to be blessed in the city, blessed in the field, blessed when you come and when you go. Everything your hand touches shall be blessed, because God is the source of your strength and the strength of your life. Please make sure to follow us on Woman Preach Nation, in Woman Preach Nation, so that you can stay abreast of all that is happening through our programming. God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening.